couple of years in Mozambique, Malawi, and I've been here in Senegal, West Africa, for over a decade now. I've worked in health, productive infrastructure, workforce development, equitable land rights, women's economic empowerment. So lots of different programming, and that's with USAID, the Department of State, CDC, but also non-American funders like Global Fund, FCDO, and the EU. A lot of what I do is working to build responsive cost proposals in response to submissions, enhancing financial planning processes with client organizations, and also accompanying them as they seek to revise their indirect cost structures. And that's a little bit about what we're here today. So if you've joined, you have an interest in NICRA. Maybe you have some notion of what a NICRA is, but you probably are aware of the fact that it is related to the US government, and it is related to the recovery of indirect costs. So NICRA stands for Negotiated Indirect Cost Rate Agreement. It is an agreement. It is a piece of paper, nowadays a piece of PDF paper. So when we talk informally about what's your organization's NICRA, the real answer to that question is it's a piece of paper. But what we mean by that is, what is the rate on your NICRA? When we ask about the rate, we're talking about an indirect cost recovery rate. We talk about indirect cost as something separate from our direct costs. Direct costs we feel more comfortable with. We know what those are. Those are our direct program activities. Those are our direct job costs, our program costs. We have a good sense and we're comfortable with our direct costs. But we're less comfortable with indirect, and that's natural. They're not directly related, as the name would state. So through these rates in the NICRA document, we are trying to achieve full cost recovery. That's a fancy way of saying we want this funding arrangement to cover all of our direct costs, plus a fair share of our cost of doing business, a fair share of our indirect cost. Now, you might not use the term indirect cost at your organization. You might use the term overhead or management and general costs, but for the purposes of today's session, we're talking about the same thing. When you decide to submit a NICRA, you are telling the US government that you want to enter into a relationship whereby we are going to formalize our indirect cost rate structure so that we don't have to keep talking about it each and every time I submit a proposal. When you submit this proposal to start this NICRA process, you will do so with what's known as a cognizant agency. The cognizant agency is the federal department or agency within the United States government with which you've secured the most direct funding. So if you tend to work a lot with the United States Department of State, then that might be your federal cognizant department. If you work a lot with USAID, USAID might be your federal cognizant agency. It is important to identify that agency because that is the agency to whom you will submit the paperwork that we're going to discuss in today's webinar. The NICRA, once you submit it to that federal department or agency, it has government-wide acceptance. That means you might negotiate a rate agreement with USAID, but you can use that same rate with Department of Labor and Department of Agriculture and any other department with the United States. So there's an efficiency factor once you decide to go through with a NICRA rate. Before we go into some of the details of this negotiation process and this rate, first of all, we need to know who's eligible. So to be eligible for a NICRA, there is one key criteria. You need to have a direct award from the US government. Somewhere within the United States government, you must have a direct relationship. If your relationship is only via a sub-award relationship, you are a sub-recipient, you are not yet eligible for a NICRA. That doesn't mean that you can't start the process, because there is a lot of pre-positioning that needs to happen. So any entity with a direct award from the US government is eligible for a NICRA. You can be a US-based organization. You can be a non-US based organization. It doesn't matter. US registration is not necessary. Having a physical office or presence within the 50 United States is not a requirement. Some of my European-based clients find that strange, because to unlock a lot of European Union funding, you do need to have a physical presence in an EU member state. That is not the case for the NICRA. Apart from that key eligibility, there are other nuances depending on which federal agency or department you're working with. For instance, if you will be working with USAID as your cognizant agency, you become eligible once you have that first award with USAID, and there's a limited amount of time after having received that award, that agreement, in which you can submit a NICRA. All more underscoring the fact that you need to do this ahead of time. If you're interested in a NICRA, please don't wait until the day you receive your first award. It's a little too late to get everything organized. In terms of the requirements, the top 3 requirements I would say is have a clear understanding of your cost structure. We're going to go into detail on what exactly that means, a cost structure. Be ready to support that cost structure through evidence, through supporting documents. There's a lot of supporting documents. And be open to scrutiny from both the US government and from auditors. Really, really important as well. So that means having a clear understanding of how you organize your costs, making sure it's logical. Does it follow a logical flow? Can you describe how your costs are structured within your organization? Be consistent. US government is really, really big on consistency. They want to see that your cost structure is maintains itself regardless of your funding source, whether you're self-funding or whether you're funding from outside the US government. They want to see that consistency. And being transparent. The US government during this NICRA process will ask a lot of questions. They will ask questions where you might sometimes say, it's none of your business. But in order for them to get a sense of comfort that you are charging a fair share, they will ask questions. So that notion of fair share runs through. That you have to, the burden of proof is on you to show the US government through your cost structure and through some of the documents that we're going to talk about. This is how I have shown you my fair share. This is how I ensure that you will not be overcharged in the process. So that's a little bit about what the NICRA is in terms of the document that you're going to receive, the eligibility and the initial requirements. It is a process, and organizations don't go into submitting for a NICRA lightly. So the next question I always get is this going to be worth it for us? It is a process. It is a process to submit. There are a lot of documents to submit with it, and you will be required to annually audit your indirect costs, which you might not have done up until now. You might have had an audit that looks at your program and your program or project costs, but you might not necessarily have had auditors come in and look at your indirect cost pool. And so when you negotiate with the United States government, you will have to audit those costs annually. It's not an annual renegotiation of the fundamental structure of your costs, but it's a verification of how much you actually spent. And that's where we get into these percentages, these rates that I'll demonstrate in a moment. Once you negotiate a NICRA with the US government, you never have to renegotiate it unless that fundamental structure of how you organize your costs changes. And again, we're going to get into what an indirect cost is in just a moment. In a world of dwindling resources, working with funders that understand that you have a cost of doing business is really important. Not every funder, as you probably know, will be open to funding a fair share of your indirect cost. They may say, we will fund everything in the budget as a direct cost plus 7%. Why 7%? Nobody knows. It's not indicative of anything. It's not based on any real analysis of how much it costs your organization to run its business. The US government is open to that discussion, provided you're willing to do the work and show them that you've really dug deep into how your organization operates. If you are looking to build a longer-term relationship with the US government, whether it's USAID or any other federal agency or department, then the NICRA is an attractive option because with each proposal, with each concept note, with each document that you submit, you do not have to keep talking about your indirect costs. Your NICRA has that coverage. Even if you choose not to go all the way through the NICRA process, the process of doing this self-reflection is really eye-opening. Things that you might have taken for granted that everyone in our organization views this type of cost in this way, you might find that that's not the case. So we're talking about cost structure. I've used that term a couple of times. And primarily, we're looking at direct and indirect costs. There are other types of costs, like unallowable costs, that also play into this. But primarily, we focus on direct and indirect, just to simplify the discussion. And once again, direct, we have a notion of what goes into our direct cost pool. Program activities, materials that we need to deliver our activities, direct program technical labor. We have a really good sense on our direct costs just by the nature of our work. We have less of a sense of indirect costs. So we look to the US government guidance. The uniform guidance underpins all US government departments and agencies. And that is also known as 2 CFR 200. And there are a couple of good clues as to how we can start to define this somewhat nebulous concept of indirect cost. In the appendix to 2 CFR 200, it states that costs that are incurred for common or joint objectives and cannot be readily identified with a particular final cost objective. So here we're talking about your common costs, your joint costs, which is another term that I often hear. In the cost principles of 2 CFR 200, it states that there is no universal rule for classifying certain costs as either direct or indirect in every accounting system. This is not a summary. This is verbatim from US government regulations. A cost may be direct with respect to some specific service or function, but indirect with respect to the federal award or other final cost objective. So that last sentence might not make a whole lot of sense, but in a moment, we're going to do a little poll, and you might see that a cost could be direct in certain instances, could be indirect in others. Also within the cost principles, because of the diverse characteristics and accounting practices of nonprofit organizations, it is not possible to specify the types of costs which may be classified as indirect cost in all situations. In other words, every organization has to put in the work to determine what are those costs that they consider indirect costs. And again, it sounds easy, and you're going to say, I can name 20 indirect costs at our organization off the top of my head. But when you actually do start to dig down and unpack, it becomes much more challenging. So just a graphical representation of indirect costs. When you see a house and you see all of the wood and the siding and the glass and the lovely doors, you're looking at the direct costs. You're looking at all of the things that are visible, all of the things that you can see, all of the things that when you say, I buy a house, I buy it for that. What you don't see is what's under the earth, the solid foundation, the basement, the pouring of that concrete that makes that house stable. That is what we're talking about when we look at indirect costs. If you don't have a stable foundation, the house will fall. The US government understands that, and that's why they've gone through this elaborate NICRA process to make sure that you understand what's in this orange band underneath your house, that you can explain it, you can calculate it, and you can show it to them, then they're willing to pay for it. The common types of costs that we see, not in every organization, but there's usually some sort of financial management cost that's part of your indirect cost pool. Information technology, human resources, legal team if you have one, a business development team or a proposal development team, an audit team. Again, as we just saw on the previous slide, there is no hard and fast rule. Your organization might be one in which you take all of your audit costs, you put them into a cost allocation plan, and you allocate them out directly to all of your projects. I have seen that done. That is not unusual. It might be new for you, but for another organization, that's how they've always done it. So again, there's no hard and fast rule. In simple terms, when we come back to that NICRA rate, we're looking at a ratio of two numbers. We're looking at the ratio between our direct cost, the house you can see, and the indirect cost. What is that ratio? What is that percentage? The US government does not care what that number is. Whether that number is 7% or 70%, they do not care. They want to know, have you gone through this exercise? Have you looked at your costs? And have you thought about the base upon which you apply these percentages? Remember, 70%, you multiply it by something to get a dollar value. The US government is interested in that something. Is it 7% of $1 million, which is $70,000? Or is it 70% of $100,000, which is also $70,000? So the percentage in and of itself tells us nothing. There's a much larger discussion. How big is your organization? What does your programming look like? What is the overall ratio between direct and indirect costs? There's a lot more questions than just a simple rate. And so the US government understands that, and they want to see through modeling how you have demonstrated that. Before you can model, you've got to understand what are these costs in orange. It is a fundamental component of any NICRA submission. So we're going to do a little exercise, and I'm going to force you to choose direct or indirect based on your understanding. So let's launch the first poll. I can't see if it's being launched, but maybe it is. There it is. Okay. Are these costs direct or indirect based on your understanding? Salary costs for a home office-based accountant, direct or indirect? Don't overthink it. Which one do you immediately gravitate for? And salary costs for a regional office-based finance officer working across 5 countries. And June, I can't see how many have voted. So once we get critical mass, you can just end that poll. All right, so when we look at this, we felt that most of the group felt like it was indirect, the first question. And then we had a pretty even split on the second, and that's not surprising. We didn't give you an option for unsure, needs more discussion. We apologize for that, but that was on purpose. We wanted to force you either into direct or indirect. We've got 2 more of these. Let's go to the next one. So are these direct or indirect based on your organization? The first one is laptops for project staff in year 1 of a new US government project. And 2, replacement of a project laptop due to damage in year 3 of the project. How do you normally fund these types of expenses? All right. Oh, look at this. This is why I like data. So being forced to choose between direct and indirect, almost everybody said that the laptops in year one are direct. And almost everybody said that the replacement in year three are also direct. However, there were a few more indirects in there. All of them might be right, but this just shows that not every organization is going to view every type of cost the same way. All right, we've got one more, and this one's the hardest one, I think. So in poll three, catering costs for a board of directors meeting, would you consider that direct or indirect? An airfare for a board member who's also a medical doctor traveling to Sudan to review your project's evidence-based clinical methods. I get chided that my examples aren't specific enough. So here you go, very, very specific example. Thank you for voting so quickly. So by and large, most people said that the board of directors meeting is indirect, and that makes sense. But very interestingly, I wasn't sure how question number two was going to go. Most of you said that you would consider that direct. I could see it. I could see the board of director moving off of that board advisory role and really taking on a direct program implementation role for the 2 weeks that she's in Sudan. Yeah, totally. But you have to document it. That's the tricky part. And I imagine if we had an option where it says, let me confer with my colleagues or let me see what the pulse of the organization is, many of you would have chosen that option because it's not always clear how our organization would react in some instances. So when you're negotiating the NICRA, the first thing is to classify your costs. Now, I specifically chose costs that give a lot of consternation to different clients. Board costs, certain material costs, and personnel costs. You may have others. Some communication costs, organizations really struggle on, are they direct? Are they indirect? Does it depend on what type of publication we're issuing? Lots and lots of discussion happens, really, really interesting discussion when you get a group of people in the room to look at your costs. And by group of people, I don't mean your entire finance team. It has to be cross-organizational. And once you do that, you start to summarize all of these scenarios for the US government into what's known as a cost policy statement. And that is the first and arguably most important document that you will submit as part of your NICRA. You will go through an exercise where you look at all of your different costs. You will determine what's direct, what's indirect, what may be cost allocated. So I gave that example a little bit earlier of a cost like audit that might be allocated out. What might be unallowable? The US government has certain things that they consider automatically unallowable: public relations, alcohol, fines and penalties, certain organizational costs. So it's important to know how those play into it. You would then document this into a cost policy statement, basically explaining to the US government how, along your cost categories, you define and make the determination whether something will be direct or indirect. You don't have to talk about every board member going to every country in the world, but you have to say that our board costs are generally indirect, but there may be limited instances where technical expertise will be required, and that may be a direct billable charge, but it's independent from the advisory role of the board. For example, as if I might have written something like that before. Along with this cost classification and cost policy statement, you need to be able to do the modeling. This is where we get into the Excel, the actual financials. You will have taken your previous year's audited financial data. You will regroup it into these cost classifications, pulling out board costs as indirect, regional finance as direct, etc. however you've decided to classify your costs, and you will put them into cost pools. Direct and indirect is the most simple version. You will then forecast ahead using these same classifications to be able to start to develop some trends. And from that, you can do a series of models. The NICRA submission has specific models that it requests as part of the submission to understand where those costs are, where you're going, and to start to determine what those rates are. There's a large component of this that is actually quite strategic, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. When you are doing the model, you also have to have some strategic vision into where your organization is going. How do you run your programs? How do you run your job costs? Are you a direct implementer? Are you working primarily through sub-recipient organizations? Do you do a lot of think tank-like work, or is it a lot of on-the-ground digging wells? All of these types of programming decisions play into how you might model this rate in different ways. Along with the model and the cost policy statement, there are 15 to 25 additional supporting documents that you need to submit. Yay. If you are going to submit to the Department of Interior, there's about 15 documents. If you are going to submit to USAID, there are 25 documents. So along with these two, you will also have to submit a summary of your timekeeping procedure. You will also have to submit your leave policy. The US government will want to understand how you treat paid and unpaid leave. If you're a US-based organization, you'll have to submit your annual 990. You will have to submit audited financial statements. There are many other documents besides these two that we tend to focus on, the cost policy statement and the models. Once you do have everything ready, you're feeling confident, review it all, submit it, and then begins the negotiation process. So that negotiation process can vary. It can take a long time, depending on how well you've done steps 1, 2, and 3. The negotiation might be very, very short. I want to show some common issues that we find with NICRA submissions when we work with different clients. The cost policy statement, as we've mentioned, as we've just seen through the polls, really, really important. Until you know what are your indirect costs, you're not going to be able to advance any farther. So not getting cross-organizational buy-in on your cost classifications is probably the hardest thing to do and the thing that will set you up for, unfortunately, the most chance of having a failure. You really need to get cross-organizational buy-in on your costs. In the model, selecting a rate structure that does not accurately reflect your organization's business model. So we often simplify the rate as total direct cost divided by total indirect cost. But that might not actually be most reflective of your organization. You might have had a year in which you had a very different type of programming. It might not be your standard programming, or you might be, as part of your strategic vision for the next 5 years, changing your approach. And maybe, for instance, you're going to be doing less direct implementation and more sub-recipient management. So these types of things do have a big impact into how you select an appropriate model. I always advise clients to look at least 3 models seriously to see, do we want to base our percentages on labor? Do we want to base it on total cost? Do we want to base it on some sort of modified version of that total cost? What do those calculations look like? Let's lay them out and see and discuss. In terms of the additional documents, not providing all of the schedules or all of the supporting documents is often something that the NICRA reviewer will come back immediately and say, please submit X, Y, and Z as per the guidance. So you really want to make sure that you are looking from the beginning at all of the different documents that are required. And unable to negotiate properly due to poor preparation and or understanding of US government regulations and expectations. So not getting 1, 2, and 3 right automatically makes your negotiation position harder. The US government will pry. They will ask questions. They need to understand. There was a recent audit of the US government's NICRA process, finding that they weren't pedantic enough. They weren't asking enough tough questions. So be prepared for tough questions because they are coming. If you don't understand US government regulations, if you aren't familiar with cost principles, you're going to have a harder time with this. If you're trying to do this all in a 1-month process while everyone in your organization is really busy, you're not going to be very well prepared for the responses back from the US government. So how can we mitigate these issues? Take time to do the cost classification. I probably said that already 7 times, but it is the most important element. Get buy-in from across the organization, not just finance. It's very, very convenient for organizations to just say finance will do it. And as a finance person, I'll say, that's great. I'm going to align all the costs with my chart of accounts, and everything is going to tie up in a nice, neat bow for me at the end of the day. But that might not be what my technical person on the front line really needs. So if my technical team isn't there, if my HR team isn't there, if my business development team isn't there, they're going to have some questions for finance afterwards. So make it a cross organizational team. As I mentioned before, model several rates. Don't just get fixed on one. It's very, very tempting to just say we want to go with this rate structure. Look at many options. Always good to have a bit of a choice there to see the one that's the best fit. Understand all of the agency submission requirements from the beginning. If you're working with maybe a cognizant agency like USAID, they have a 70-page guide with checklists in them that shows all of the 25 documents that you need to submit. Don't wait until the end. Get started on all of those. Dispatch, delegate, have HR take some of them, have finance take some of them. And then prior to submission, do anticipate where the US government is going to have questions. If you've worked with the US government before, you know that they like to ask questions on timekeeping. You know that they like to ask questions on budget management. How do you follow along your budget execution? They might ask questions on, is this something standard in your accounting system? Because every year you're going to have to audit this. And if it took you 3 months to fit your accounting data into this model structure, you're going to have to do that every year. Do you want to do that every year? Are you open to that level of additional work? So you want to make sure that you're anticipating the questions that might be coming. Now, where can we help you? Of course, we can help you. So Humentum does a lot of NICRA support. There's a lot of consultants on the Humentum team that have negotiated NICRAs either from the recipient side or on the support side to ensure that your business covers all of its costs. Generally, the associates that work on this will start with a desk review. They'll look at your organization's key policies. If you have any cost recovery policies, if you have a reserve policy, your finance, they'll look at your timekeeping, your HR, all of these things where we know there will be a lot of scrutiny and questions. The next step, the cost classification, very important. It will usually begin with a sort of basic training to make sure that we have the same fundamental understanding of indirect cost rate, unallowable cost, situational cost, etc. And then we'll go through an exercise where we will actually look at your costs one by one. It becomes very easy to determine where there is general consensus and where there is a sense of discussion. Sometimes the discussion can be surprisingly heated. Once the cost classification exercise is complete, we have what we need to help draft the cost policy statement. We have lots of tools, lots of templates that can be used for that. Also for the modeling, lots of templates and tools that can help with that. Number 4, pausing to discuss our options. Is it right? Is it the best fit? Do the cost classifications still make sense? Does the model make sense? Did we find one that works for us? Where's our programming going next year? Is this going to help us in the long run? or are we going to have to negotiate a whole new rate structure in 5 years? Sometimes having that external opinion can be really, really helpful. Supporting documents, as I mentioned, 15 to 25, it's a lot, and some of them are quite complicated. So making sure that you have someone to accompany your team as you compile these, do an initial review can be very helpful. And Humentum can be there for the negotiation phase, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months out after you've submitted. Humentum can be there to review the questions you get back and help formulate answers. Throughout all of this, probably the most useful feature of this type of consultancy support is the strategic guidance. Just getting guidance from the beginning. Here's our initial concerns. We heard this. We had a NICRA before. It was a nightmare. We have 7 affiliated companies. How does that work? We have headquarters both in the UK and United States. How is that going to work? All of these types of questions our experts can look at and help you analyze. Great. So with that, I wanted to have some time. It looks like we've got about 15, 20 minutes, which is great, for Q&A. So June is going to provide some questions. Just have to find them. Okay. So the first question, what is a fair share of indirect cost? Oh, that is a great question. And the answer is it varies. It really does vary based on where you see your organization going. So at a first step, how I would define fair share is once I've determined what goes in my indirect cost pool, and then what goes in my direct cost pool, I would model it, simplified, no modifications, no fancy bells and whistles. What does it look like when I look at direct and indirect? Is that fair? Some organizations might say, yeah, that's exactly right. And some say, it's a good fit for where we're at right now, but with our strategic vision, we're going to be changing. So then you have to get into the scenario analysis. Then you have to start looking at, well, what if we did more subrecipient monitoring? What if we started to do these long-term infrastructure improvement projects that we're going to have? We might actually need a little bit more. So that fair share is a really relative concept. You want to model it, you want to document it, and you want to be able to show it and explain it to United States government. If you can do that, you will have checked that box of fair share. It's a roundabout way of saying it really depends on your unique set of circumstances. The US government will be open to looking at your unique set of circumstances. Another question, what's the window of time to apply for a NICRA after receiving an award? It depends again. It depends on the entity that will be your cognizant agency. If it's USAID, if you're brand new to a NICRA and you've never had one before, they only give you 3 months to do a NICRA. 3 months to do all of that and get organizational buy-in while you're running your organization is tight. If you had a NICRA maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago and it's no longer active and no longer valid, you can renew it, renegotiate it. And for that, you get a little bit longer, you get 6 months. And the reason you get a little bit longer is because they want you to pull in the data from your most recent audit. So 3 months to 6 months is the answer for USAID. Other federal agencies and departments might have slightly different terms. It depends on their specific agency guidelines. Another question. So one can apply for a NICRA before you get your first prime award, i.e. during proposal stage, and do not need to wait until you have the award. No, that is incorrect. You must have a direct award. However, during your proposal, you can say, we anticipate, if we are the successful applicant, to submit for a NICRA. And based on that, we have gone through all of the legwork and we have determined that our NICRA will be 16% of total direct cost, assuming that we have put a budget in favor of that. So you can do it as if you have the NICRA. I think USAID would be quite impressed with that. I know organizations that have done that. So you can put that forward as if it's already a fait accompli, it's already there. but you cannot actually submit the paperwork until you get that award. It's a process. How long will it take? Typically the first time. It depends on the cognizant agency. USAID has had quite a backlog, so they have been a little bit slow in recent years, but there's been a lot of pressure on them to speed it up. But then they've also had to hire more human resources. So with all those twists and turns, I can't exactly tell you how long it will take, but plan to settle in. Plan for it to be a couple of months before all of the negotiation is finalized. The NICRA reviewers will take their time to go through all 25 of those documents. They will go through the Excel models. They will try to follow it and trace it to your cost policy statement. And it's not uncommon for them to come back with 20, 25 questions that they need to feel comfortable with before they approve your NICRA. Another question, it's not always necessary to have a direct prime relationship with a federal agency to be eligible for NICRA. Subawardees under federal awards can also qualify. Is that correct? That is incorrect. You must have a direct relationship with the US government to be able to negotiate a NICRA. Subawardees have other options available to them to recover their indirect cost. Notably, they can use the 10% de minimis rate, which is soon to go up to 15% de minimis rate. They can budget their indirect costs as direct, so have a complete budget with a fair share portion of indirect cost, or they can use what's known as a fixed amount schedule for their indirect costs. All of these are beyond the scope of our webinar today, but there are other options if you choose not to have a NICRA, or if you are still in a subawardee relationship. But subawardees cannot get NICRAs. Subawardees may have had NICRAs from when they had direct relationships. That is possible. The second question there is, can subawardees use their NICRA to request indirect costs from the prime awardees? Yes. If a subrecipient already has negotiated a NICRA and you can produce that piece of paper that is still valid, then yes, your prime recipient organizations must, it's a must, it's not an option, must accept the NICRA. It is actually written into the regulations that if you have a NICRA and you choose to use it, then it must be accepted for US government work. Good. So we have a few more questions, which is great. Is it possible to get a NICRA without audited financial statements? No. I've worked with many departments and agencies within the US government, and they all require some form of audited financial statements. Perhaps if they're not yet audited and you're trying to get ahead of the time, the US government might consider preliminary financial statements, but I would be on the cautious conservative side of that. And I would say I would send in a message, a letter, or an email stating that we intend to submit a NICRA. However, we don't have audited financial statements yet, but we have statements that we are quite comfortable with. Can we build our proposal based on those? My sense is they're gonna say no, but I think it's always worth trying. Is USAID the most involved, or what would be the best agency to use when unsure of the cognizant agency? Well, you shouldn't be unsure. If you have direct relationships with the US government, you should plot them out and find out which is the agency from which you receive the most funding. USAID is, because it works primarily with organizations that are working outside of the United States and thereby foreign organizations, it does tend to be quite particular. It does tend to try to go through all of the details. Not to say that other agencies don't, but there tends to be a bit of additional scrutiny with USAID. I find the Department of State to be a relatively relaxed, if I can use that term, cognizant agency. I've also been quite impressed with the Department of Labor. If you are working on population and maybe you have a lot of work with Department of Labor, that has also been a department that I've found reacts swiftly has really good pointed questions and is really trying to help you get this NICRA approved. All right. What else do we have? We have more questions. What is the limit of the indirect cost for US funded projects? So there is no limit on indirect costs. Your costs are your costs. Obviously, if you have $10 million in programming costs and you have $40 million in indirect costs, somebody's going to point that out and say, that doesn't make sense. But provided you're a rational organization and you leverage your resources internally wisely, that's not a problem. Your costs are your costs. So unlike other funding agencies around the world, the US government isn't going to say that's too much. They might say, you spend a lot in postage. Why is that? And then you would come back and say, well, we do mailing campaigns or whatever it is, why you spend so much in postage. So they may ask questions, but they're not going to say, this is too high, reduce this. That's not how the US government works when it comes to NICRA negotiations. I think we have a few more minutes. I'm going to try to get to as many of these questions. They're great questions. If an organization receives funds from CDC, NIH directly, can that organization apply for a NICRA? Yes, you would apply through the Department of Health and Human Services. So yes, you can. I have to say the Department of Health and Human Services has a bit of a reputation. The CDC in particular, it's not based in Washington like everyone else. They're in Atlanta. So they kind of go their own way. So negotiations with CDC or Department of Health and Human Services can take unexpected turns. But yes, you would be able to negotiate directly with Department of Health and Human Services. When you apply for the NICRA for the first time, do you apply for a provisional final rate or just a provisional rate? And is it for the current fiscal year or the next fiscal year? Oh, I was waiting for the rate question. So the rate question, there are many types of rates. The most common is what the person asked for, which is provisional and final. So just briefly how that works is you would model a rate for the year ahead, and you would say, we are submitting this documentation based on our audited financial statements and a projection of where we see ourselves in the next year. Based on that projection, the US government would give you a provisional rate. Let's just say 21% of something. I don't know what the something is, but 21% is your provisional rate. You would then go through that next year. You would then audit all of your indirect costs. You would prepare a schedule for your auditors. Your auditors would verify that, you actually didn't spend 21%, you actually spent 25%. You then get to finalize that rate at 25%, meaning that missing 4%, you can go back and recover from all of your US government funding agreements, pending budget availability. As long as the project isn't closed out and there's some budget room in your projects, you can recover that, which is really nice. It means that we're going to look at your actual costs and we're going to be able to recover it. That 25% then becomes a final rate. It can also become your next year's provisional rate. And then at the end of the next year, you would audit it and get another final rate, and so on and so forth. That's the annual maintenance, if you will, of the NICRA process. Those aren't the only ways. There are also predetermined rates, which are slightly different, and they have a set of criteria of when those might be appropriate, and they're for organizations that their indirect costs vary little from year to year, and you can show that they've been relatively stable for a long period of time. And there's also fixed rates. And before you say, yes, I want a fixed NICRA rate, it's not what you think. It means that there's a rate that's established that's fixed, let's say 20%. And if you go over and under in the year, that's carry forward to the next year. So it's fixed in the fact that that's what you're going to recover for that year, but the variation over or under, whether you need to repay the US government or whether the US government needs to give you more, that gets carried forward to future years. All right. Oh, we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try to do maybe one more, and then we're going to have to unfortunately wrap it up. But I love all these questions. I could talk NICRA all day long. Is funding strictly grants, or can private companies that bid on USAID projects get a NICRA? Yes. For-profit companies, private enterprises, many of them have NICRAs. In the development world, organizations that we know very well that have large US government contracts also do have NICRAs to cover their indirect rate. Remember, the NICRA isn't profit, right? The NICRA is a cost of doing business. Think of it as three pots of money. You have your direct costs, your indirect costs, and then your profit if you're a for-profit entity. But these two are still different. Indirect and profit are still different. So yes, for-profit entities can negotiate a NICRA, and often do if they are going to be working a lot with the US government. All right, so I know there's a lot more questions, and I would love to stay all day and answer them, but June would kick me out, so I can't do that. But we are going to try to capture these questions and get you these answers. I'm not exactly sure yet when it will come. So in the meantime, some resources for you. For instance, you can attend a training such as Maximize NGO and INGO Recovery. This is one of Humentum's flagship courses that really dives into this question of rates. How do we maximize our indirect cost recovery? There is a session specifically on NICRA. There's a section on the NPAC if you work with FCDO. And then there's a broader section on what about all of those funders that have less written guidance and that maybe just assign arbitrary percentages. How do we work that in? So a really, really interesting 5-session live webinar course. I think June is going to pop that into the chat so that you could take a look at that course. If you're working with grants and cooperative agreements, the flagship course on USAID rules and regulations is a great one. There is a large section on NICRA in that course. If you're working more in the acquisition contract space with USAID, Humentum offers a Mastering USAID cost reimbursement contracts. So yet another course where indirect costs and profit will be talked about. If you have done the courses and if you feel like you are now ready to actually get started, Humentum has a series of NICRA consultancies, which I laid out just previously. So you can take a look at the NICRA consultant services, get in touch with Humentum that way. And also any questions that are really of a burning nature, we have an email for you. It's client@humentum.org. So that will also be available to you should you have any really urgent questions you just can't wait for any answers. All right. June, did I miss anything? What else needs to happen?
No, that's all.
Okay. All right. So with that, thank you all very much. We are going to try to look at the questions, all of the questions. I know June is busy gathering them all on the back end. I hope you found this helpful. I hope it wasn't too much. We were trying to find the right balance of not overwhelming you, but making it worth your time. But we really appreciate all of you finding the time on this Wednesday to join us for this session. Thank you all so much.
Robert.
Thank you. I don't know who Albert is, but thanks, Albert.
Thank you, Robert.
Cheers. Thank you, René.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Robert. This was great. Lovely. Fantastic to listen to it. I was very happy with it too. So hope you have a
Oh,
great
good. Thank you, Christian.
Cheers. Bye, folks.
Oh, Stephanie. Nice to see some familiar faces.
Hey, Rob. It was a great class. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Robert. You answered all my questions. It was really helpful. Thank you so much.
Oh, that is great. Thank you, Natia. Lovely to hear that. Yes, the recording will be shared. Momentum will share that.
We love to have some other meetings like that related with some other issues that are very important and useful like this.